When people say family comes first, I always wonder, what if your family is the one holding you back? I'm Dylan, 32 years old, and for the better part of my adult life, I've been cast as the failure in the family. You know, the one everyone laughs at behind closed doors, or worse, right to my face. It didn't always used to be like that. When I was younger, I was close with my mom, really close. My dad passed when I was 13, and from that moment, I tried to step up in every way I could. Mowed lawns to help with groceries, skipped college parties to drive my little sister to soccer practice, worked full-time while studying online, anything to keep things steady for the family. But it was never enough, especially not for my older brother, Jared. Jared's the golden child. He's 35, works in finance, has a high-rise condo, wears expensive watches, drives a brand-new Audi, and somehow always finds a way to bring up how things used to be at every family gathering. You know the type. He went to an Ivy League school on a full ride, got a job through one of Dad's old connections, and never lets anyone forget it. According to Mom, Jared could do no wrong, even when he did. And me? I was the kid who meant well, but lacked direction. It didn't matter that I started my own landscaping business at 24, worked 70-hour weeks, or bought a foreclosure property I spent years fixing up with my bare hands. To them, I was still the brother who once borrowed money and took 6 months to pay it back. The one who dropped out of college after Dad died. The one who didn't show up in a suit and tie. It all came to a head during one of those infamous Sunday family dinners. Mom insists on them every month. The food is great. I'll give her that. But the conversations? Not so much. There's always a point where someone brings up old stories, passive-aggressively rehashes a mistake I made in 2016, or hints that I still have time to figure things out. Jared usually leads the charge, of course. He finds a way to smile while cutting you open with his words, as if being smug is some kind of intellectual sport. His wife, Becca, giggles like it's part of their love language, and even my younger sister, Lily, avoids eye contact with me whenever he starts. Anyway, this dinner started off like all the others. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, wine, Becca talking about her yoga retreat, Jared commenting on the markets, Lily scrolling through her phone, half listening. I was quiet as usual. I've learned it's safer that way. Safer to just nod along, eat, and leave early. But then, Mom cleared her throat and tapped her wine glass gently with her fork like she was about to make a toast. Everyone turned to her. I've been thinking about updating my will, she said. Just like that. No build-up, no context. Just those words, and suddenly, the entire room shifted. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. Jared perked up like someone had said his name. Becca leaned in, her interest piqued. Even Lily put her phone down. I'm not dying or anything, Mom continued, trying to laugh it off. It's just, you never know. And I think it's time to put things in order, just in case. No one said anything at first. Then Jared, never one to miss an opportunity, gave this little smirk, God, that smirk, and said, Relax, Mom. I'll handle things when he messes up again. He didn't even glance at me when he said it. Like I wasn't even in the room. Like it was just some family inside joke they'd all agreed on. Becca snorted into her wine. Lily gave this half smile and looked down. And Mom? She chuckled. Actually chuckled. Then she turned to me, like she just remembered I was still breathing. Oh, Dylan, you know we're just teasing, she said with that patronizing tone I'd come to loathe. You've always had your heart in the right place. My heart in the right place. That's code for you try, but you fail. That's the phrase she used when I lost out on that commercial contract. When I told her I was going to buy that old house, and she said, Dylan, you barely know what you're doing. When I sold my truck to cover business expenses and she asked if I was getting desperate again, I stared at her, then at Jared, then at everyone else at the table. My face felt hot. My ears were ringing. But I didn't say a word. I just reached into my satchel, yeah, the same one Jared made fun of last Christmas, and pulled out a blue folder. It was a little worn at the edges. I'd gone through it 100 times. I slid it across the table, right between the butter dish and the gravy boat. What's this? Mom asked, picking it up with a confused frown. The property, I said quietly. The one you all thought I lost in that lawsuit. She flipped it open. I watched her eyes move across the page. Line 1, then line 2, then 3. Her smile vanished. The room went silent. Mom's hands trembled as she held the folder, her eyes darting across the page like she was trying to make sense of a foreign language. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The silence around the table was so thick I could hear the ticking of the antique clock on the dining room wall. Jared leaned over, trying to get a peek. "What's that?" he asked, voice casual, like we were talking about a grocery list. Mom didn't answer. She just kept reading. Her eyes narrowed the further she went down, and then, without looking at me, she closed the folder and set it down gently, as if the paper inside might explode if she handled it too roughly. "Is this real?" she finally asked. "Very real," I said. My voice was calm, maybe too calm, considering how badly my hands were shaking under the table. "It's the full deed. I had the title cleared last month. Property's paid off in full, and it's worth triple what I bought it for." Becca let out a tiny laugh, but it sounded more confused than amused. Jared furrowed his brow. "Wait," he said, pointing at the folder. "That place. You're telling me you still own it? I thought, didn't you get sued?" "I did," I replied, eyes never leaving his. "But I countersued, and I won." Quietly. Mom looked stunned, like someone had rewritten her entire worldview in one sentence. "But I thought you told me the bank was involved." "I let you believe that," I said. "Figured it wasn't worth the fight back then." Funny how no one bothered to ask more than once. The mood shifted. You could feel the air being sucked out of the room. For once, I wasn't the brother needing help or the son who couldn't get his life together. I wasn't the burden, the embarrassment, or the afterthought. I was something else now, and that scared them. Especially Jared. He scoffed and leaned back in his chair. "So what? You held on to it. Big deal. Doesn't change anything." I wanted to respond, to fire back, but I didn't. I let the folder speak for itself. And maybe that was what made it hit harder. Because for the rest of the dinner, no one said much. They poked at their food, avoided eye contact, and slowly shifted topics. To Lily's job, Becca's new home office design, anything but me. But I noticed the shift. A quiet, almost invisible reshuffling of the family's hierarchy. And Jared? He noticed it too. I saw the calculation in his eyes. The same eyes that used to look at me like I was a broken vending machine, good for nothing except the occasional pity snack. Now those eyes were wary, suspicious. The following week, I got a call from Mom. She wanted to talk about things. That's her favorite phrase when she wants to reassert control, but pretend she's being gentle. So I went over. Sat on the same couch I grew up on, across from the same woman who used to hug me after nightmares, and now made me feel like a guest in my own memories. "I'm happy for you," she said, but her voice was thin, stretched like plastic wrap over something sour. "I just wish you'd told me sooner. Would you have believed me?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she started talking about Jared. How stressed he'd been lately, how work was taking a toll, how he didn't mean to be so harsh. The usual script. "I know he says things that sound rude," she continued, "but he's under a lot of pressure. And he's always looked out for the family." Right. Looked out. Like when he convinced Mom to co-sign on his condo because he didn't want to dip into his investment account. Or when he borrowed $5,000 from Lily's college fund and promised to pay it back once the market rebounds. That was 3 years ago. "You're not asking me to do something for him, are you?" I asked slowly. She hesitated, then smiled. A smile that looked more rehearsed than heartfelt. No, of course not. Just be patient with him. You know how he is." That was the moment I knew. It didn't matter what I achieved. To her, Jared would always be the one worth defending. I was the one worth tolerating. Barely. Over the next few months, things got weirder. Jared started calling me out of nowhere, acting overly friendly, inviting me to lunch, asking how business was going. "Just checking in, bro," he'd say, like we were suddenly best friends. I didn't buy it, especially when he started asking questions about the property. "You ever think about flipping it?" he asked one afternoon while we were grabbing coffee. "Nope," I said. "It's not just an investment. It's mine." He nodded, sipping his latte. Right. Just thinking long-term, you know? Legacy stuff." Legacy. That was Jared's favorite word lately. He'd been bringing it up a lot, especially after Mom's comment about updating her will. Something was brewing, and I could feel it in my bones. Then came the betrayal. It was subtle at first. I got a letter in the mail from the city's zoning department. Apparently, someone had anonymously reported a code violation on the property. Something about improper fencing and structural modifications. I just finished renovating the guest house, so I thought maybe it was a mix-up. But the citations kept coming. Noise complaints, trash violations, even a notice about unregistered business activity on the premises. It didn't make sense. I lived alone, worked out of a separate office. I wasn't throwing parties or turning it into an Airbnb. Someone was trying to bury me in paperwork. I filed appeals, spoke with city reps. One of them let something slip during a call. "Look, off the record," he said. "We don't usually follow up on reports this aggressively unless there's legal interest from someone with a personal stake." That stuck with me. I started digging. Checked the public records for requests, filed FOIAs. It took weeks, but I finally got confirmation. The reports had been filed from a firm, Jared's firm. I stared at the document for a long time, not really seeing it. Just feeling this slow, boiling rage rise up in my chest. He was trying to sabotage me, undermine everything I'd built, quietly, like a parasite. But the worst part wasn't what he did. It was how easily I saw it coming. The betrayal didn't feel shocking. It felt inevitable. I confronted Mom, sat down at her kitchen table, dropped the documents in front of her, and said, "Your son is trying to ruin me." She looked at the papers, blinked. "Dylan, this must be a misunderstanding." "It's not," I said. "It's premeditated. He's been trying to push me out since the dinner. Since I showed you the deed." She pushed the documents back toward me. "I'm sure Jared has a reason." "A reason?" I almost laughed, but I didn't. I just stood up and said, "You always make excuses for him. You always have. Dylan, don't make this a competition. It's not a competition if one of us is actively stabbing the other in the back," I snapped. "It's war." Her face fell. "Don't say that." But I meant it. That was the day I stopped seeing them as family and started seeing them as obstacles. I didn't go to the next Sunday dinner, or the one after that. I didn't answer Jared's calls, didn't respond to Mom's texts. I went quiet, silent, observing. And while they thought I was sulking, I was building, researching, preparing, planning. For the first time in a long time, I understood what it meant to be alone, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually. After I walked out of Mom's kitchen that day, I didn't go home right away. I drove, aimlessly, through neighborhoods I hadn't visited in years, down streets I used to bike as a teenager, past the old school parking lot where I had my first kiss. There was something numbing about it, like I was peeling off layers of my past, one stop sign at a time. I ended up parked near the overlook just outside town. From there, you could see everything. The buildings, the blinking cell tower lights, the faint glow of the highway stretching like veins through the darkness. I stayed there until sunrise. Didn't cry, didn't scream, just sat, processing, replaying every word from that conversation, every insult disguised as advice, every laugh I'd swallowed over the years. And I realized something. I had been begging for scraps from a table I helped build. That week, the final blow came. It wasn't a punch to the face. It wasn't a confrontation. It was a letter, plain white envelope, no return address, dropped off by courier to my mailbox. Inside, a formal legal notice. Jared was suing me. He was contesting the deed to the property, claiming a breach of verbal agreement from years ago, some nonsense about how I'd supposedly promised to split the property with the family if I ever won the lawsuit I'd buried quietly. He cited a vague family understanding, misquoted text messages, and even pulled a dusty old email chain from 2018 where I mentioned wanting to turn the house into a family project. It was pathetic, but it was dangerous. Because Jared wasn't stupid, he had lawyers, connections, and more money than I did. And worse, he had Mom's support. She co-signed a statement included in the filing, claiming she remembered Dylan agreeing to share ownership. I sat there, on the porch, reading that line over and over again, the sun baking the paper in my hands. I felt like someone had kicked a hole straight through my chest. My own mother had signed off on a lie, not even for money. For Jared. That night, I hit rock bottom. I didn't sleep, couldn't eat. My business started to slip. Clients noticed I wasn't as responsive. I lost a major landscaping contract with a corporate office park. One of my subcontractors backed out of a renovation deal. Bills piled up. I had to dip into the emergency savings I'd built painstakingly over years. The walls felt like they were closing in. There were days I couldn't get out of bed. Days I stared at my reflection and didn't recognize the man I saw. I felt like I was sinking into the version of myself they'd always assumed I was. The one who couldn't hold things together. The one who meant well, but always fell short. I shut my phone off for 2 weeks. Didn't speak to anyone. Even Lily reached out, said she was sorry for staying silent, that she didn't know things had gotten that bad. I ignored the message. I wasn't ready. And then, in the midst of all that darkness, something unexpected happened. One of my old clients, a guy named Marcus, called me out of the blue. I'd done a full backyard renovation for him 2 years earlier, and he'd always been a solid guy, respectful, paid on time, even brought me lemonade when I worked in the heat. "Hey," he said, "I'm expanding my real estate portfolio. Bought a bunch of fixer-uppers near the old Ridgeway district. You interested in doing the landscaping and exterior rehab?" I almost said no. I was tired, broken. But then I remembered what that place used to be. Ridgeway was where I'd first fallen in love with landscaping, back when I was 19 and working under a gruff old guy named Clarence who taught me everything from bricklaying to irrigation. So I said yes. And that single yes changed everything. The first house was a mess. Overgrown weeds, foundation cracks, tree roots destroying the front walk. But it was quiet work, honest work, and something about being knee-deep in soil again, smelling fresh mulch and running my hands through clean-cut grass. It centered me. I remembered who I was when no one was watching. Marcus liked my work. So did his partners. One house turned into 3, then 5. I started hiring again. Not big, just 2 part-timers. But it felt good to lead a team again. To create. To fix things that had been abandoned. During this time, I also went back to therapy, something I tried briefly in my 20s but quit when money got tight. This time, I stuck with it. Talked through the resentment. The betrayal. The years of trying to earn love from people who only saw me as useful when I failed. My therapist said something that stuck with me. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop asking people to see you differently and start seeing yourself clearly. That line became my anchor. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already made up their minds. I started documenting everything. Every receipt, every business deal, every communication with the city, not because I needed to prove anything to Jared, but because I wasn't going to let him rewrite my story again. I hired my own lawyer, not a flashy one, but sharp, detail-oriented. The kind of guy who read every footnote twice and loved paperwork more than coffee. He looked over Jared's claim and shook his head. "This is smoke," he said. "But if we don't put it out fast, it could still burn something down." So we got to work. Quietly. Strategically. And while the legal side unfolded, something else was happening too. Something I hadn't expected. People started noticing the transformation. Not just in my business, but in me. An old high school acquaintance, someone who used to laugh along with Jared's jabs, reached out to collaborate on a community garden project. A woman I'd briefly dated years ago, someone I'd ghosted out of insecurity, messaged to say she was proud of me after seeing photos of my projects online. Even Lily started texting again, longer this time. She told me she'd been distancing herself from the family, too. That she'd overheard Mom and Jared talking about how to deal with Dylan's stubbornness. "I think they're scared of you now," she wrote. "Not because you're dangerous, but because you don't need them anymore." She was right. I didn't need their approval, their validation, their fake smiles and passive-aggressive jokes. I didn't need Sunday dinners where I was served shame between courses. I was building something real. By the end of that year, my business had doubled in revenue. I had 5 full-time employees. We'd landed a contract with a luxury condo development outside the city. I reinvested carefully, bought a second property, small, but charming, and flipped it with Marcus's team. Turned a decent profit. Kept going. I still kept the deed to my original property locked in a safe. Not because I needed it anymore, but because it reminded me of who I was when no one else believed in me. And then, just when I thought things had finally settled, that maybe the worst was behind me, Jared pulled one last move. Only this time, I wasn't caught off guard. In fact, I was ready. Because what he didn't know was that the entire time he'd been watching me, trying to figure out how to break me again. I'd been watching him, too. And the moment he overstepped, that's when everything I'd been building quietly in the background would finally come into the light. There's a particular kind of silence that comes after you've been betrayed. Not the explosive kind, not rage or grief. It's quieter, heavier. The kind of silence where your hands stop shaking, your mind stops racing, and everything clicks into place with cold, surgical clarity. That's where I was. That was the version of me Jared didn't see coming. By the time he launched his second legal maneuver, a a revised petition alleging I had misused family equity. Whatever that even means, I was already 10 steps ahead. My lawyer, Samir, dissected it like a hawk. He flagged inconsistencies, noted reused language from boilerplate contracts, and highlighted a glaring problem. Jared was using his firm's resources for personal gain. Again, smells like abuse of position, Samir said, tapping the margin of the complaint. If this hits the right ears, he's not just losing this case. He's risking his license. I smiled. Not out of cruelty. I'm not wired like Jared. But because, finally, the scales were tipping. And this time, I was holding the weight. But I wasn't going to rush revenge. That's what Jared would have done. Flaunted, postured, tried to humiliate me publicly. No, my path was different. Mine was slow, intentional. Every step mattered. Every move needed to land clean. So I started gathering pieces. The first piece was Lily. We hadn't been close in years, not since she moved in with Becca and Jared briefly after college and came back looking like someone who'd survived a political campaign. But lately, she'd been reaching out more. At first, just text messages. Then a coffee meetup. Then another. She opened up about everything. How Becca had tried to get her to sign off on some family fund that would consolidate assets, funnel them to Jared. How Mom had started pressuring her to be more loyal. How Jared had apparently boasted at a poker night that Dylan would never see it coming. He thinks you're still licking your wounds, Lily said, stirring her drink. Thinks you'll give up eventually. I didn't respond. I just pulled out a small notepad from my jacket and scribbled something down. What's that? She asked. Step 4, I replied. The second piece was Becca, or rather, the crack in Becca's pristine facade. Through a mutual friend, a former client of mine who happened to go to her yoga studio, I found out she'd recently been venting to her inner circle. Apparently, Jared's obsession with fixing the Dylan situation was putting strain on their finances. He'd taken out a second mortgage on their condo, without telling her, to fund some of his legal antics. She found out when a payment bounced. I filed that detail away. I didn't need Becca on my side. I just needed her angry. The third piece was property records. I spent late nights poring over public databases, legal filings, even scanned PDFs from the city archive. I traced every LLC Jared had quietly set up, every parcel of land he'd funneled money through. The man was smart, I'll give him that. He'd hidden ownership through shell companies, layered paperwork, and tax shelters. But he got sloppy on one project, a failed real estate development outside of Durham. It had quietly gone under. Jared had poured nearly $600,000 into it and walked away with nothing but a black mark buried in the footnotes of a quarterly report. It was his weak spot, and I had it. Now I needed to make sure Jared believed he still had control. So I started attending Sunday dinners again. Not every week, just enough to seem inconsistent. Uncertain. I'd show up 15 minutes late, claim I had client calls, or was just passing through, and always downplay my progress. I let Jared make his jokes again. Let Mom ask her loaded questions. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just smiled, nodded, and let them talk. One night, Jared leaned back after dinner and said, "Hey, if this lawsuit stuff ever gets too expensive, let me know. I'll throw you a lifeline. Family discount." He laughed. So did Mom. I just raised my glass and said, "Appreciate that, man. I'll keep it in mind." And then I went home and finalized the paperwork for something I'd been building in the background for months, a private trust. I named it Whitestone. Through Whitestone, I quietly transferred the deed to my property out of my name. I gave myself power of attorney over it, but on paper, it now belonged to the trust, which, as far as any court was concerned, was managed by a third-party administrator. Jared's lawsuit was now aimed at a phantom. I'd set it up in Nevada, under airtight confidentiality laws. He'd have to spend tens of thousands just to figure out where the trail went cold. But I wasn't done. I used the trust to invest in a real estate venture, a boutique residential complex. Small units, high-end finishes. I partnered with Marcus and another investor, a sharp woman named Tasha I'd met through a landscaping client. She was connected, discreet, and ruthless in the best way. Jared had no idea I was in the development game now. No clue that the parcel across town he'd once considered bidding on was already being transformed into the Grove at Whitestone. No clue that his firm's rival had just entered a partnership with me. No clue that one of the subcontractors I hired was his former project manager. the one he'd fired last year for attitude problems. And still, I kept showing up at dinners. Kept playing the fool. The tipping point came at Thanksgiving. Mom decided to host at Jared's house that year. Big event. Fancy catering. Folded linen napkins. Even Becca's parents were there, which meant she was pretending everything was perfect. Always a good sign something was very wrong. Dinner was fine, if a little stiff. But after dessert, the topic turned, as it always does in dysfunctional families, to money. Becca's dad asked Jared how the firm was doing. Jared gave his usual spiel. Strong quarter, good projections, lots of movement in real estate law. Then, without missing a beat, he glanced at me. Though we've had to waste some resources on family drama, he said with a chuckle. Can't name names, but let's just say some people don't understand contract law. I laughed, genuinely this time. Yeah, I said, contracts are funny things. So easy to write. So hard to enforce when the asset disappears. His smile twitched. What's that supposed to mean? I stood, walked to the entryway table, and pulled out an envelope I'd stashed there earlier. Thick one. Sealed. I slid it across the table, just like I had with the deed months ago. This is for you, Jared. Happy Thanksgiving. He stared at it, but didn't touch it. What is it? Proof of ownership, I said, for something you tried to sue. Let's just say your case might hit a jurisdictional snag. Mom's eyes darted between us. Becca looked like she was holding her breath. Jared opened the envelope. Inside was a notarized statement from the Whitestone Trust, legally affirming full ownership of the property in question, with a jurisdiction shield and all the necessary disclaimers. The language was brutal, deliberate. Jared skimmed it. His face drained of color. This isn't legal, he muttered. Oh, it's very legal, I said. But you're welcome to challenge it. Just know you'll be challenging a corporate entity in a state with no obligation to respond to out-of-state filings. And I've already filed to dismiss your current claim. He slammed the envelope on the table. You think this scares me? No, I said. But it should slow you down. And then I walked out. I didn't slam the door. Didn't raise my voice. Just left. I didn't need to win the argument. I'd already won the game. But what Jared didn't realize, not yet, anyway, was that the trust wasn't the end. It was just the trap. After Thanksgiving, Jared spiraled faster than even I anticipated. See, the envelope didn't just rattle him, it exposed him. His firm had a strict internal rule: no personal cases using company resources. The language in the Whitestone document implied that Jared had been using his firm's tools and attorneys for his personal vendetta. And because he'd been confident I'd lose, he'd gotten slack with his digital footprint. His paralegal, who he had been underpaying for years, had finally had enough. Whether she saw the envelope at Thanksgiving or whether Jared said something reckless afterward, I'll never know. But she tipped off the firm's senior partners. A routine audit was launched, and with Jared's loose string, they pulled and pulled until half his desk drawers spilled out. Unauthorized filings. Hours billed for non-existent clients. Personal expenses disguised as research materials. It wasn't illegal outright, but it was enough to raise eyebrows in a building where reputations were currency. The partners quietly suspended him pending review. That alone might have satisfied some people. But this story didn't end there. While Jared was trying to plug the holes in his sinking career, the second part of the setup kicked in effortlessly. Not because I orchestrated it perfectly, but because years of entitlement and shortcuts had built an entire maze around him. All I did was turn on the lights. The failed real estate project in Durham, the one he'd sunk $600,000 into, wasn't dead after all. Not in the way he believed. Through Whitestone, through Tasha's network, and through an investor I met by complete chance while landscaping his vacation home, we were able to acquire the failed development at a tax lien sale. The previous LLC had collapsed, but the physical land remained, and Jared had walked away just before the rebound. See, the city had quietly approved redevelopment grants for the area, new public transit plans, federal incentives. Jared had assumed it was a dead zone. He had moved on. But the land he abandoned? Now it was the foundation for a mixed-use complex called Hollow Ridge Crossing, and Whitestone owned 62% of it. The day construction began was the day Jared received a letter from the city, one that showed public notice of the redevelopment. He recognized the parcel number instantly. He knew exactly what he had walked away from. He also knew what it meant that someone else now owned it. So when he found out Whitestone was the owner, and then found out I was Whitestone, he crumbled. I didn't brag, didn't throw it in his face, Didn't send him screenshots or show up to gloat. But I did return the favor. He had sued me silently. So I let the world expose him loudly. Not illegally. Not maliciously. Just with facts. With his suspension quietly spreading through professional circles, and with Hollow Ridge becoming public knowledge, the whisper network around Jared ignited. Investment partners he'd chased for years stopped returning his calls. His condo association questioned him about late payments. Even his Audi dealership flagged concerns about financial irregularities. The same man who mocked me for years was now drowning in the same waters he'd once pushed my head under. And I wasn't even holding him there. I just watched from the shore. But the final blow, the real finale, wasn't mine. It came from Becca. After the second mortgage discovery, she'd begun unraveling pieces of her own marriage. Not the public parts. The private ones. The bank statements. The hidden accounts. The credit lines opened without her consent. The business retreats that didn't align with his location history. She hired her own attorney. Quietly. Discreetly. The same way she decorated her home. With precision and intention. And one Friday morning, a cold, brittle morning in February, I got a message from Lily. You should come to Mom's house tonight. Something's happening. I didn't want drama. Didn't need chaos. But something in her phrasing made me go. I walked into Mom's living room and found her pacing, phone in hand, visibly rattled. Lily sat on the sofa, arms crossed tight. What happened? I asked. Mom didn't answer. She just handed me her phone. A text from Jared. Mom, I need help. Becca left. She took everything. They're investigating the firm. I need a place to stay. Mom's voice shook. He's your brother, Dylan. He's your son, I corrected. But before she could plead, the front door opened. Jared entered, suitcase in hand, eyes hollow, clothes wrinkled, the perfect image of a man who'd just walked through a storm that only he created. He looked at me. Not smug. Not angry. Not superior. Just tired. Can we talk? He asked. It wasn't a command. Not even a request with teeth. It was the first genuine sentence I'd heard from him in years. I followed him to the porch. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a voice I barely recognized, he spoke. I messed up. I didn't respond. You were right. About Mom. About the property. About everything. Still, I waited. Finally, he exhaled shakily. I thought, if you failed, then I wouldn't have to look at myself. Wouldn't have to admit I wasted my chances. I kept comparing us and convincing myself I was winning. He looked away. But you were building something real. And I was just chasing the appearance of success. The wind cut through the quiet. He swallowed hard. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I don't know what to do now. I thought about the kid he used to be, the one who taught me how to ride a bike, who sat with me when our dad passed, who promised he'd always look out for me. I didn't see that kid anymore. But I also didn't see the monster I'd built up in my head. I saw a broken man. Still, I wasn't there to fix him. You deal with your consequences, I said calmly. Just like I dealt with mine. He nodded, tears forming but not falling. I'm sorry, Dylan, he whispered. Maybe he meant it. Maybe he didn't. But I didn't need closure from him, because I'd already built it myself. Jared didn't stay at Mom's long. The investigation into his misconduct forced him to resign from the firm. Not publicly. They didn't want a scandal, but with enough conditions that he walked away without recommendations. The condo went into pre-foreclosure. Becca filed for divorce. And he moved into a small rental 2 towns over, trying to piece his life back together. Mom tried to blame me at first. Expected me to swoop in and help him get back on his feet. But I had spent too many years being the safety net while everyone else played tightrope games above me. This time, I didn't step in. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. Lily stayed in my life regularly. We rebuilt a relationship that never should have been fractured. She visited my property often, especially once the Grove and Hollow Ridge projects began booming. She even invested a little, her first independent financial step outside the family shadow. As for Mom, well, some relationships don't break loudly. They just fade. I didn't cut her off, but I stopped bending myself into knots to fit her expectations. Stopped explaining my choices. Stopped chasing her approval. And something surprising happened. Without effort, I found peace. The landscaping company thrived. Whitestone expanded. Hollow Ridge crossed 80% occupancy within 9 months. And the property everyone thought I'd lose, the property that once symbolized my biggest failure, became the heart of something much bigger. On the anniversary of finalizing the trust transfer, I visited the property at sunset. The sky was streaked with orange and purple. The air smelled like pine and fresh earth. I stood on the porch, hands in my pockets, and breathed in the quiet. No anger, no bitterness, just clarity. People often think revenge is about destroying someone else. But standing there, I realized something different, something truer. Real revenge is building a life so solid that no one can shake it. Real revenge is living in a way that makes your enemies irrelevant. Real revenge is outgrowing people who once caged you. I walked back inside, turned off the porch light, and smiled to myself. Not because I'd won, but because I was finally living on my own terms. And that's when it hit me. The ending wasn't about Jared falling. It was about me rising. I found out I'd been disowned through a voicemail I almost deleted. I was 31 years old, standing in a grocery store aisle debating whether I really needed cereal, when my phone buzzed with my mother's name. I let it go to voicemail because we hadn't spoken in weeks, and because every call lately felt like it came with a hidden test I didn't know I was failing. When I listened to it in the car, her voice was tight and unfamiliar, like she was reading from a script she didn't agree with but planned to follow anyway. She said, "Your father and I have decided it's best if you don't contact us anymore. We believe your sister. Please respect our wishes." That was it. No questions. No conversation. No chance to explain. Just a clean, efficient erasure delivered between the bakery and frozen foods. I'm Julian, 31, the older sibling by 4 years, and until that moment I thought I understood my family. I always knew my sister, Mara, had a way of being believed. She didn't have to raise her voice or cry on cue. She just tilted her head slightly, spoke softly, and somehow the room rearranged itself around her version of events. Growing up, if something broke, it was assumed I'd been careless. If she forgot an assignment, it must have been because I distracted her. I learned early that defending myself only made things worse. Silence, I was told, was maturity. So I got good at being quiet. Too good, maybe. Our family wasn't loud or openly cruel. That almost made it harder. My parents prided themselves on being fair, rational people. They loved to say things like, "We don't play favorites, and we raised you both the same." But the truth lived in the details. Mara's feelings were always treated as facts. Mine were treated as reactions. If she felt hurt, someone had done something wrong. If I felt hurt, I was overthinking. That pattern followed us into adulthood, subtle but consistent, like a background hum you stop noticing until it's gone. The accusation came out of nowhere, at least to me. One Tuesday evening, my father called and asked if I could come by on the weekend. His tone was formal, which should have warned me. When I arrived, Mara was already there, sitting on the couch with her hands folded, eyes red but dry, like she'd already done her crying and moved on to the performance. My parents sat across from her, shoulders angled inward, a united front. I remember thinking it felt like a meeting I hadn't been invited to but was expected to attend. My mother spoke first. She said, "Mara told us some things. Serious things." I asked what things. She hesitated, then looked at my sister. Mara didn't look at me when she said it. She stared at the coffee table and said, "He's been lying to you for years. Not about one thing. Not about a misunderstanding. Years." A lifetime accusation, dropped casually, like it had always been waiting there. I laughed, once, out of pure disbelief. That was a mistake. My father's face hardened immediately. He said, "This isn't funny, Julian." I tried to ask what she meant, what lies, about what, but the room closed ranks. My mother said, "We know you've always had trouble taking responsibility." My father added, "This explains a lot, actually." Each sentence landed like a door locking behind me. Mara finally looked up then. Her eyes met mine for half a second, and there was something in them I still think about. Not anger. Not sadness. Certainty. She knew she was being believed. She didn't need to elaborate. She talked about feeling manipulated, about realizing patterns, about connecting dots she'd ignored before. Everything was vague, just enough to sound thoughtful without being specific. When I asked for an example, she said, "See, this is what I mean. You always do this. You twist things." I tried to speak. I really did. I started explaining situations she was referencing without naming, offering context, reminding my parents of events they'd witnessed themselves. But every sentence I said was interrupted, reframed, or dismissed. My mother kept saying, "This isn't about your perspective. My father said, "You've had years to be honest." It became clear they weren't listening to understand. They were listening to confirm. By the end of it, I was exhausted. My throat hurt from trying to stay calm. My hands were shaking, though I kept them in my pockets so no one would notice. My mother stood up and said, "We need space." My father nodded. Mara stayed seated, looking small and wounded, the picture of someone who'd finally spoken her truth. No one asked me to leave. They didn't have to. I understood I was already gone. The weeks after were surreal. I sent a message the next day, asking to talk. No response. I sent another a week later, longer, careful, choosing every word like it might explode. Still nothing. I stopped after that. Not because I didn't care, but because every unanswered message felt like a verdict being reissued. I went through old photos on my phone and felt like I was looking at evidence from a life I'd been quietly removed from. What hurt the most wasn't the disowning itself. It was how easy it had been. How quickly they accepted a version of me that fit a narrative they'd apparently been holding on to for years. I replayed the conversation in my head, wondering what I could have said differently, what tone might have saved me. Eventually, I realized the truth I was circling. There was nothing I could have said. They hadn't wanted an explanation. They wanted closure without discomfort. Months passed. My birthday came and went without a call. Holidays were silent. I started building routines that didn't include waiting for my phone to ring. I told myself I was fine, and most days, I believed it. Then, last week, my phone buzzed again. My mother's name. This time, I answered. Her voice was urgent, strained in a way I hadn't heard before. She didn't ask how I was. She said, "Julian, we need your help. This is serious." I felt something shift in my chest, not hope, not anger, but a quiet, steady awareness that whatever came next would change things in a way they couldn't undo. When my mother said it was serious, she didn't explain what she meant. She didn't apologize either. She just spoke the way people do when they assume urgency erases history. I asked what was going on, and there was a pause, the kind where you can hear someone covering the receiver with their hand. Then my father's voice came through, lower, controlled. He said, "We'll explain later. Right now we need to know if you're willing to help your sister." That word help landed wrong. It wasn't a request. It was an expectation, delivered as if nothing between us had ever happened. I told them I needed time to think. My mother sounded offended by that. She said, "This isn't about old feelings, Julian. Old feelings." As if being cut off without a conversation was a mood I'd had and gotten over. As if the months of silence were a misunderstanding, not a choice they'd made and stood by. I said I'd call back. I sat in my car for a long time after that, hands on the steering wheel, engine off, watching people walk past like the world hadn't tilted slightly on its axis. That call opened a door I'd been trying to keep shut. Over the next few days, the messages started coming. At first, they were careful. "We're worried. This is bigger than family drama." Then they became sharper. "We didn't raise you to abandon your sister. This could affect all of us." Not once did anyone say they were wrong. Not once did they ask how I'd been, or what it felt like to be erased from the family without a defense. Every message assumed the same thing Mara always had, that I would show up, that I would absorb the impact quietly, and that my silence would be mistaken for consent. I eventually agreed to meet them, not because I trusted them, but because I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed to know if there was any part of me they still saw as human. We met at their house, the same living room where I'd been quietly dismantled months earlier. Everything looked exactly the same. Same furniture. Same framed family photos, including one of the three of them at a beach last summer, taken after I'd already been cut off. I noticed my absence immediately, the way you notice a missing tooth when you run your tongue over it. Mara was there, of course. She greeted me with a cautious smile, like we were distant co-workers forced into a meeting neither of us wanted. She talked first, launching into a story about stress, about pressure, about feeling overwhelmed. She said she was dealing with a situation that required trust and resources, and that the family needed to be united. United. That word again, repurposed to mean obedience. As she spoke, I realized something unsettling. She wasn't nervous. She was irritated. Irritated that this was taking time. Irritated that I hadn't already agreed. She kept glancing at my parents, checking their reactions, recalibrating her tone slightly when my father frowned or my mother nodded. It was a performance I'd seen before, refined with age. She mentioned decisions I'd supposedly made in the past patterns of behavior she claimed had caused problems. Each example was either exaggerated or outright false. When I corrected her, calmly, she sighed and said, "See, this is exactly what I was telling them." That's when my mother turned to me and said, "Julian, you have to stop making everything about you." I remember the exact phrasing because something in me cracked open when she said it. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't insulted anyone. I was simply stating facts. And still, I was the problem. They explained what they wanted from me then. Money, indirectly. Access, more directly. My father said, "You're in a position to help in ways we can't." I asked how they knew that, since they'd apparently believed I was a liar for years. He brushed it off. "We know you're capable," he said, like capability was separate from character. Like usefulness could exist without trust. I asked them why. If they believed Mara without question months ago, they were suddenly willing to talk to me now. My mother's answer was chilling in its honesty. She said, "Because this affects us. Not because they missed me. Not because they regretted what they'd done. Because the consequences had finally landed close enough to matter." The conversation spiraled from there. Every time I tried to bring up the disowning, they reframed it as a pause. Every time I mentioned being silenced, they accused me of holding grudges. Mara eventually lost patience entirely. She leaned forward and said, "You always do this. You wait until things are critical and then make it about your feelings." That sentence settled over the room like a verdict. My parents nodded. They didn't correct her. They didn't question it. In that moment, I understood something I'd been avoiding for years. This wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about hierarchy. The breaking point came quietly, the way real ones often do. My father stood up and said, "If you don't help, you're choosing to stay out of this family." He said it like he was offering clarity, like this was a reasonable boundary. I looked at him and realized he was serious. This was the same choice, repackaged. Obedience or exile. Again, I asked one final question. I asked Mara what she'd told them months ago exactly. I said I wanted specifics. Dates. Examples. Something concrete. She hesitated, just for a second. It was the first time I'd seen her hesitate. Then she said, "You know what you did." My mother immediately added, "We're not reopening that." The door slammed shut before it could even fully open. Something in me went very still. I felt a strange calm settle in, the kind that comes when you stop hoping. I realized that no amount of explaining would ever compete with the story she'd told first. I stood up, thanked them for their time, and said I needed space. My mother looked genuinely surprised. My father looked annoyed. Mara looked furious, like someone who'd just lost control of a situation she thought was locked down. As I walked out, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. It read, "Think carefully about what you're doing." I didn't reply. I drove home with a clarity that scared me. Because for the first time, I wasn't wondering how to fix this. I was wondering what else they'd been willing to believe about me without question, and how far Mara had been willing to go to make sure I never got a chance to speak. After I left their house that night, I didn't feel dramatic or empowered. I felt hollow. There's a difference people don't talk about. Empowerment comes later. First comes the quiet collapse, the part where you realize the floor you thought you were standing on was never solid to begin with. I drove until my gas light came on, pulled into a random station, and sat there longer than I needed to. I didn't want to go home. Home felt too small for what had just settled inside me. The next few weeks were the lowest I'd been in years. Not visibly, not in a way anyone around me would have noticed, but internally, everything unraveled. I went to work, answered emails, nodded in meetings, smiled when appropriate. Then I'd come home and sit on the edge of my bed fully dressed, staring at the wall like I was waiting for instructions that never came. I replayed conversations on a loop, not just the recent ones, but everything. Childhood moments. Small dismissals I'd brushed off. Times I'd apologized just to keep the peace without fully understanding why I was apologizing at all. The hardest part was the doubt. Not about them, but about myself. When enough people repeat the same story about you, especially people who raised you, it gets into your head. I caught myself wondering if I really had been manipulative without realizing it. If I'd rewritten my own memories to protect my ego. If maybe I deserved the silence, the exile, the conditional love. Those thoughts were insidious. They didn't shout. They whispered. My sister's voice echoed the loudest. "You always do this." I'd heard that sentence my whole life, usually right before I backed down. I started noticing how often I'd been the one to bend, to smooth things over, to swallow frustration so others could stay comfortable. I called it being mature. In reality, it had been self-erasure dressed up as virtue. Rock bottom didn't come with a dramatic event. It came on a Tuesday night when I realized I'd stopped telling people personal things altogether. A coworker asked how my family was, and I said, "Good," without thinking. The word tasted wrong. I got in my car afterward and laughed once, sharp and humorless, because even now, even with no one around to perform for, I was still defaulting to the version of myself that caused the least friction. Something shifted after that. Not suddenly, not cleanly, but I got tired of feeling like a ghost in my own life. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want vindication yet. I just wanted solid ground. So I started small. I stopped checking my phone compulsively, waiting for another message loaded with guilt. I muted family threads I hadn't officially been removed from, but clearly wasn't welcome in. I said no to things I didn't want to do without explaining myself afterward. I also started writing things down. Not letters. Not messages I planned to send. Just facts. Dates. Conversations. What was said and by whom. At first, it felt petty, like I was building a case no one would ever see. Then I realized I was doing it for myself. Gaslighting only works when memory is blurry. I was done letting my past be rewritten. Around that time, something unexpected happened. I started sleeping better. Not perfectly, but deeper. The constant low-grade anxiety I'd carried for years began to ease, like background noise being slowly turned down. I realized how much energy I'd been spending anticipating disapproval, even when my family wasn't physically present. Losing them had hurt, but it had also removed the constant evaluation. For the first time, my choices didn't feel like auditions. I poured myself into work, not as an escape, but as something I could control. I took on projects I'd previously declined because they might require conflict or visibility. I spoke up in meetings instead of letting others reframe my ideas as theirs. When a client pushed back unfairly, I held my ground. Each small moment added weight to a version of myself I hadn't fully met yet. A version that didn't apologize for existing. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same family that accused me of manipulation had trained me to doubt my own voice. Reclaiming it felt awkward at first, like using a muscle that had atrophied from neglect. But the more I used it, the stronger it became. I started to trust my instincts again. When something felt wrong, I stopped explaining it away. Socially, things changed too. I realized how many of my friendships mirrored my family dynamic. I was the reliable one. The listener. The person people vented to but didn't check on. I didn't cut anyone off dramatically. I just adjusted. I stopped overextending. I noticed who stepped forward and who drifted away when I wasn't constantly available. The results were clarifying. Months passed. My parents didn't reach out again for a while. Neither did Mara. The silence was different this time. It wasn't a punishment. It was a vacuum. And in that vacuum, I grew. Quietly. Without witnesses. Then came the first real sign that the ground beneath them was shifting. My father called one evening and left a voicemail. His tone was careful again, but strained. He said they needed to talk. That things had become complicated. He didn't mention my sister by name, but he didn't have to. The subtext was obvious. Whatever problem they'd hinted at before hadn't resolved itself. It had grown. I didn't return the call immediately. I sat with it for 2 days. Not out of spite, but because I finally understood something crucial. Urgency had always been their lever. They rushed me so I wouldn't think too hard. This time, I let myself think. I reread my notes. I remembered how easily they'd closed ranks. I asked myself a simple question. If nothing had gone wrong for them, would they be calling me now? The answer was obvious and oddly freeing. When I did call back, I set boundaries without announcing them as boundaries. I said I was open to talking, but only if we addressed the past honestly. My father deflected. My mother tried to soften things with nostalgia. I stayed calm. I repeated myself. Eventually, my mother said something that told me more than she realized. She said, "We just didn't think it would get this far." That sentence followed me for days. Not because it hurt, but because it confirmed everything. They hadn't expected consequences. They hadn't expected me to stop chasing their approval. They hadn't expected the story they'd accepted so easily to turn against them. Meanwhile, my sister began reaching out indirectly. A mutual cousin mentioned she'd been stressed. A family friend hinted that she was overwhelmed. No one apologized. No one corrected the record. The narrative remained intact, just inconvenient now. I felt a strange mix of emotions during that period. Sadness, yes, but also something like pride. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that comes from surviving something that could have broken you and realizing it didn't. I wasn't healed. Not even close. But I was standing. The rise didn't look like triumph. It looked like stability. Like knowing who I was even when no one validated it. Like understanding that being believed isn't the same as being truthful, and that sometimes the people who accuse you the loudest are protecting something fragile in themselves. The shift started the day I realized I finally had leverage, even if they didn't know it yet. It came from an unexpected place. A mutual acquaintance, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, reached out casually. He said he'd heard there was family stuff going on and wanted to check in. I almost brushed it off, but something in his phrasing caught my attention. He sounded cautious, like he was choosing his words carefully. We met for coffee. Halfway through, after some awkward small talk, he leaned back and said, "Look, I don't know what's true, but I figured you should know what people are saying." He hesitated, then added, "Mostly what your sister's been telling them." I didn't interrupt. I just listened. What he described wasn't just a continuation of the old story. It was an escalation. According to Mara, I wasn't just dishonest anymore. I was unstable, vindictive, someone to be wary of. She'd framed my distance as evidence of guilt, my silence as proof I had something to hide. And people believed her. Not everyone, but enough. That's when it clicked. This wasn't damage control. This was preemptive. She wasn't reacting to consequences. She was trying to get ahead of them. I went home and pulled out the notes I'd been keeping. Dates, messages, voicemails. I listened to my parents' calls again, this time not as their son, but as an observer. The urgency, the pressure, the conditional language. I realized something crucial. They weren't calling me because they suddenly doubted Mara. They were calling because her story was starting to crack under its own weight. Over the next few weeks, I stopped being passive. Quietly, carefully, I started reconnecting with people I trusted. Not to vent, not to plead my case, just to reestablish presence. I met friends for dinners I'd postponed for years. I accepted invitations I would have previously declined out of habit. I showed up as myself, without disclaimers or apologies. I also stopped protecting Mara's image. That was harder than I expected. There's a lifetime of conditioning that tells you not to speak badly about family, even when family has already buried you. But I learned quickly that telling the truth doesn't require embellishment. I didn't accuse. I didn't rant. I simply corrected misinformation when it surfaced. Calmly, factually. And I noticed how people reacted when the story suddenly had two sides. Some withdrew. Those were the ones who preferred simple villains. Others leaned in, curious, unsettled. They started asking questions Mara hadn't prepared answers for. Meanwhile, my parents' behavior grew more erratic. One week, my mother would send a long message reminiscing about my childhood, peppered with soft guilt, as if warmth could substitute for accountability. The next, my father would call and talk logistics, asking hypothetical questions about access and timing, never once addressing the reason we were estranged in the first place. It was like watching two people try different keys on a lock, hoping one would turn. I didn't confront them yet. That was intentional. I needed them to feel comfortable enough to keep talking. The real turning point came when I received something I wasn't supposed to see. A former colleague of my sister's reached out anonymously. No greeting, just a message that said, "I don't know if you want this, but I think you should have it." Attached was a series of screenshots, emails, messages, conversations where Mara spoke about me in ways that were unmistakably calculated. Not emotional, strategic. She talked about controlling narratives, about making sure our parents stayed aligned, about how I was predictable because I hated confrontation. Reading it felt like stepping outside my body. This wasn't someone spiraling. This was someone managing outcomes. I didn't respond to the sender. I didn't forward the messages to my parents. I didn't confront Mara. I saved everything. Organized it. Cross-referenced dates with moments I remembered clearly. The disowning. The silence. The sudden need for my help. Patterns emerged. What struck me most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was how confident she'd been that I'd never push back. That I'd take the blame quietly, the way I always had. That assumption was the foundation of everything she'd built. And foundations fail when the ground shifts. I started preparing for that moment. I consulted a lawyer, not to sue, but to understand my options. Knowledge is power, and I wanted to know exactly where I stood. I learned what I could say, what I shouldn't say, and how documentation changes dynamics. I didn't tell my family. I didn't hint. I just listened more carefully when they spoke. I also set personal boundaries that doubled as pressure points. I stopped responding immediately. I asked clarifying questions instead of offering solutions. When my parents made vague statements, I asked them to be specific. It frustrated them. They weren't used to me slowing the conversation down. They weren't used to resistance that didn't look like rebellion. Mara noticed too. Her messages shifted tone, less indirect, more pointed. She accused me of turning people against her. I didn't deny it. I asked what she meant. She backtracked, then accused me of playing games. I told her I was just trying to understand. The irony wasn't lost on me. The more composed I became, the more agitated she grew. And agitation leads to mistakes. One afternoon, my father called unexpectedly and said, "We need to sit down. All of us." The emphasis on all of us made my pulse quicken, but I kept my voice steady. I agreed, on the condition that we address everything openly. There was a pause. Then he said yes. After the call ended, I sat in silence, letting the weight of what was coming settle in. I didn't know exactly how or when the truth would surface. I only knew that the version of me who would walk into that room wasn't the same one they'd dismissed months earlier. When we finally sat down together, it wasn't dramatic at first. No shouting, no tears, just the four of us in the same living room where everything had started unraveling months earlier. The difference this time was subtle but absolute. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't bracing myself. I wasn't hoping they'd understand. I was prepared. My parents sat side by side on the couch. Mara took the armchair, legs crossed, phone face down in her lap like a shield. She looked composed, but I noticed the small things. How often she adjusted her sleeve. How her jaw tightened when I didn't immediately speak. She was used to controlling the tempo. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. My father cleared his throat and said, "We're here to put everything on the table." He said it like a declaration. I nodded and said, "Good. That's exactly why I agreed to come." My mother smiled tightly and added, "We want to move forward as a family." I looked at her for a moment, then said, "We can't do that until we're honest about how we got here." The smile faded. Mara shifted in her seat. They invited Mara to speak first. Of course they did. She launched into a familiar narrative, softer this time, more polished. She talked about misunderstandings, about feeling unsupported, about how my distance had hurt her. She framed herself as exhausted, burdened by a situation she never wanted. It was convincing. It always had been. When she finished, my father turned to me and said, "Julian?" It wasn't an invitation. It was a test. I didn't argue with her story. I didn't contradict her point by point. Instead, I said, "Before I respond, I want to ask something." I looked directly at my parents. "When you decided to cut me off, did either of you ask for proof?" The question hung in the air. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. My father said, "We trusted your sister." I nodded. That's what I thought. Then I reached into my bag and placed a folder on the coffee table. I didn't slide it toward them. I didn't open it. I just let it sit there. The presence of it changed the room immediately. I said, "I didn't come here to beg for forgiveness or to explain myself again. I came to tell the truth you refused to hear back then." I turned to Mara, "And to correct the story you built while I stayed quiet." She laughed once, sharply. "See? This is what I meant. He's turning this into a performance." My mother looked torn. My father frowned, but he didn't interrupt me this time. I opened the folder. Inside were printed copies of messages, emails, and timelines. I didn't dump them out. I took them out one by one, explaining calmly what each was. I showed them the messages where Mara talked about making sure they stayed aligned, where she described me as predictable, where she explicitly said that if I was allowed to explain myself, things would get complicated. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just read. Mara's composure cracked fast. She tried to interrupt, to explain context, to say things were taken out of context. I stopped her gently and said, "You'll have time to respond." I didn't interrupt you. That sentence alone felt like reclaiming years of swallowed words. Then I played the voicemails. My mother's voice, telling me not to contact them anymore. My father's voice, explaining that they believed her and saw no reason to hear my side. Then another voicemail, months later, asking for my help because it was serious. I didn't comment. I didn't have to. The contrast spoke for itself. The room went quiet in a way it never had before. My mother covered her mouth. My father stared at the floor. Mara stood up abruptly and said, "This is unfair. You're twisting things." I looked at her and said, "No. I stopped letting you twist them." She turned to our parents, her voice rising now. She said they were betraying her, that I was manipulating them, that they were falling for it again. Again. That word slipped out before she could catch it. My father looked up sharply. "Again?" he asked. That was the moment everything collapsed. She tried to recover, but it was too late. The mask was off. The calm victim tone was gone, replaced by frustration and panic. She said things she couldn't take back. Accused them of never protecting her enough, of needing to control the situation because no one else would. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that this had never been about fear. It had been about control. My mother started crying, not quietly, not performatively, genuinely. She kept saying, "We didn't know," over and over, like repetition might undo the damage. My father looked older in that moment than I'd ever seen him. He asked Mara directly if she'd lied. She didn't answer. She just kept insisting she'd done what she had to do. I stood up then, not to leave, just to shift the dynamic one final time. I said, "This is the part where you expect me to forgive, or to comfort, or to fix what's broken." I looked at my parents. But that's not my role anymore. They looked at me like they were seeing me clearly for the first time. And I realized something important. This wasn't about humiliating Mara. It wasn't about punishing my parents. The revenge wasn't loud or cruel. It was simply refusing to carry the consequences of their choices for them. I told them I was done being the family's silent buffer, done absorbing blame to keep the peace, done proving my worth through usefulness. I told them that trust, once broken this deeply, doesn't reset because the truth finally becomes inconvenient to ignore. Mara left the room crying and angry. My parents didn't follow her. That alone said everything. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was messy but contained. Mara's relationships frayed as more people quietly connected dots she'd never expected them to compare. My parents tried, awkwardly, to reconnect with me, to apologize, to explain. I accepted the apologies without offering absolution. I kept my distance without bitterness. The family didn't go back to what it was. It couldn't, but it finally became honest. As for me, I didn't win anything tangible. No inheritance. No grand reconciliation. What I gained was something far more valuable. My voice. My clarity. My peace. I learned that silence isn't strength when it protects lies, and that sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply standing still while the truth catches up to the people who tried to outrun it. The day my parents chose to finally listen was the day I stopped needing them to believe me at all.